Welcome to Revelation BIB 406, Lecture 3. In today's lecture, we are going to finish up the letters to the seven churches. We mentioned that those were started in chapter 2, and then chapter 3, we find the conclusion of those letters. And then we're going to move into chapter 4 and do an overview of that chapter as well. In chapter 3, we have the final 3 of the 7 total letters. So chapter 2 contains the first 4 letters, and then Revelation chapter 3 covers the church, the letter to the church at Sardis, the letter to the church in Philadelphia, and then the letter to the church in Laodicea. So the conclusion of those 7 letters is in chapter 3. Chapter 4 is going to begin the third section of the outline given in chapter 1, verse 19. We talked about that 3-part outline. You have the things which John is seeing, talking about the details of the vision, and then you have the things which are happening at that present time, which would be those letters written to the 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3. Those would be the current events, current happenings in those churches. And then you have the things that will be hereafter, talking about the future things that would happen sometime after John saw this vision. So there's a little nuance there depending upon which interpretive grid you're going to be applying to the book of Revelation. These things would be future based on happening after the time that John had this vision and wrote these things down, but there would be a nuance there if future is future closer to the lifetime of John. So if he wrote this prior to AD 70, and then these events happened with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, it still would have been future for John, but it's past for us. Or are these events future even yet for us still? And that's a major difference depending upon, again, which interpretive grid, if you're going to apply the preterist view or more of a futuristic view to your interpretation of Revelation. There's a major distinction that you would make there. So bottom line, these things were future for John, but our question today would be, are they still future for us? Did they already happen after John wrote them but prior to our time? Or are these still yet future even for us today? And that's a major question you have to ask yourself, and that's going to be answered by the interpretive grid that you choose to apply to the book of Revelation. So the scene in chapter 4 begins by taking us into the throne room of God. So we have this opening statement by John in Revelation 4. After this I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. The first voice which I heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, "Come up here, I will show you what must take place after this." So this is, again, that very clear introduction of a future happening right here in chapter 4. At this point, it's important for us to talk about the teaching of the rapture, especially if you hold to a premillennial or dispensational viewpoint or interpretive grid. The idea of a rapture or teaching on a rapture plays a very vital role in that particular viewpoint or interpretive system. So let's talk about this for a moment. First of all, the word rapture, it does not appear in the book of Revelation, nor does any specific teaching occur on this idea. There's more of an argument from silence that's made, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The verse that would be most specifically addressing this type of event would be found in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 17, where it talks about those that are alive who are left will be caught up. There's a catching up that's talked about in 1 Thessalonians 4:17, and that translation there, caught up or catching up, that comes from the Greek word raptoro, which is the derivative of our English word rapture. So that word rapture comes from that Greek word raptoro, and it just means a catching up or a catching away. And so those that would hold to the idea of a rapture event, they would go to that verse in 1 Thessalonians. Then also they would make an argument that the word church or the idea of the church, it's not mentioned again after chapter 3 in Revelation until chapter 22, verse 16. So the 7 letters written to the 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3, that's the last mention of the word church until you get all the way until chapter 22, 16. So the argument would go something like this: since the church is not mentioned, the reason it's not mentioned is because the church is not present for the circumstances and events that are talked about up until the time you get into chapter 22. So if the church is not there, there has to be a reason that it's not there and talked about, and therefore this idea of the doctrine of doctrinal teaching of a rapture would come into play, because it would have the church in heaven caught up together with the Lord and removed from the earth while the events for the bulk of the book of Revelation are taking place on earth. The church is gone. Many scholars believe that the rapture itself occurs between chapters 3 and 4. That will be important to know for testing purposes later on, that this teaching on rapture, this is the place where it's thought that this takes place, is between chapter 3 and chapter 4. At this point, let's go into chapter 4 and just do a kind of a verse-by-verse commentary here. We see how John opens up the chapter. He says that he looks, and behold, a door is open in heaven, and there's a voice that says, sounds like a trumpet. It says, "Hey, come up here. I'm going to show you what must take place after this." So you see this futuristic type of language, the things that will happen after. So we would, again, tie this back into our 3-part outline. This would be the beginning of the things that happen after those things that are going to be occurring contemporary to the author John. So these are future events. And as we begin to look through, we see that John is invited into the very throne room of God. And God is seated there on the throne. Verses 1 through 3 describe what that throne looks like in the scene there. He says that the appearance is like of these precious stones, jasper, carnelian, like a rainbow, had the appearance of an emerald. So you have these beautiful precious stones talked about. We would say that there is a connection here, a tie-in to the Old Testament priest when he would wear on the breastplate. They would have these precious jewels and stones there. Some of the same ones are mentioned in the Old Testament, so you have a definite connection to that here in chapter 4. And then also we find a description of the throne in more detail beginning in chapter 4. It says, "Around the throne there were 24 seats, and on those seats were 24 elders, and they're clothed in white garments. They have golden crowns on their heads. The throne itself, there are flashes of lightning and rumblings of thunder coming out of the throne, and there are 7 torches of fire, which represent the 7 spirits of God. Before the throne itself, there is a sea of glass like crystal." So this idea of a crystal sea is found here in chapter 4, verse 6. And then around the throne on each side are these 4 living creatures that have eyes in front of them, behind them, and then there are descriptions given of these 4 different particular creatures. So we'll look at that in a moment. The 24 elders, these would be representative of the orders of priests in the Old Testament. So this would be basically a representative body, and the analogy would be looking back to the Old Testament and the 24 orders of priests that are found there. The Holy Spirit would be seen to be represented by those 7 torches of fire, and then the 4 living creatures in verses 6 through 8 probably represent various attributes of God. So the lion would refer to his majesty and omnipotence. The calf would refer to his patience or continuous labor. The man would refer to intelligence and rational power, the idea of man being created in the image of God. That would imply that intelligence and the rational thinking power. And then the eagle would represent sovereignty or supremacy. So all of those would speak to a different attribute of God himself. And those are important to know for testing purposes. I would write those down and make sure you have those for study later, that the lion would represent majesty and omnipotence, the calf, patience or continuous labor, the man, intelligence and rational power, the eagle, sovereignty, and supremacy. You don't have to memorize those, but be familiar. It would be like a true, false, or multiple choice or matching type situation on the test.